We have a picture of the medieval jester in our heads. He wears a strange floppy hat with bells on it. His clothes are a mismatched mess of bright colors. He tumbles and juggles. He tells silly jokes and makes funny faces. He is a fool. A simple clown hired to make the king laugh. This picture is not wrong, exactly. But it is incomplete. It is like looking at a single puzzle piece and thinking you understand the whole puzzle. The image of the silly tumbling fool is a caricature. It is an echo that has been simplified over centuries, mostly by plays and later by movies. Shakespeare's fools were complex, but we often just remember the costume. Hollywood needed a simple visual, so they gave us the guy with the bells. The reality of the court jester, or court fool, was much more complicated and much more important. They were not just background characters. They were not just disposable entertainment. In many courts, the jester held a unique and powerful position. They had a real job, and it went far beyond telling jokes. To understand their real job, we first have to peel back the layers of the myth. The costume, the motley, was a uniform. It instantly told everyone who this person was and what rules applied to them. Or, more accurately, what rules did not apply to them. The bells on the hat were not just for show. They announced the jester's presence. When you heard the jingle, you knew the fool was near. And that meant the normal rules of courtly behavior were about to be suspended. The term jester itself comes from an old word for a storyteller or minstrel. It's about performance, but the term fool is perhaps more honest. The court fool was often set apart from society. This separation was their greatest strength. Because they stood outside the rigid social structure of the medieval court, they could see it more clearly. And they could talk about it more freely. Not all fools were the same. Scholars often divide them into two types. There was the natural fool. This was a person who we might today say had a developmental disability or a physical deformity. In a harsh world, a noble household might take such a person in. They were seen as innocent, children of God. It was believed their words, though simple or strange, might contain a kind of divine truth. They were not laughed at in a cruel way, but were often cherished for their unique perspective. Then there was the artificial fool. This was the professional, a man of sharp wit and intelligence who played the role of a fool. He was an actor, a comedian, a musician, and a poet all in one. He was educated, observant, and quick with a comeback. These are the jesters who truly held power. They chose to wear the motley. They chose to play the fool because it gave them a license to do what no one else could. So, we need to adjust our mental picture. The jester was not always a bumbling idiot. He could be the sharpest mind in the room. He was not just a performer doing tricks. He was a commentator and a critic. His job was not simply to make the king laugh. It was to make the king think. The laughter was just the sugar that made the medicine go down. The real job was much deeper. It was a strange mix of entertainment, politics, and psychology. And it was a job that could be surprisingly dangerous. The most visible part of the jester's job was, of course, entertainment. A medieval court could be a boring place. The days were long, filled with politics, protocol, and endless formalities. The nights needed distraction. After a feast in the great hall, when the food was cleared and the wine was flowing, the court looked for something to watch. This was the jester's stage. But the entertainment was not just a few bad jokes. A good jester had a wide range of skills. He had to be a master of all sorts of performance. Music was essential. Many jesters played the lute, or a small harp. They would sing songs. Some songs were funny, making fun of well-known knights or ladies of the court. Other songs were sad and beautiful. Some told epic stories of battles and heroes. The jester had to be able to read the room. He needed to know if the mood called for a bawdy tune or a serious ballad. Storytelling was another key skill. The jester was a walking library of tales, fables, and histories. He could spin a yarn about clever peasants outwitting a greedy lord, or a myth about ancient gods and monsters. These stories were not just for fun. They often contained a moral or a subtle piece of advice. A story about a foolish king who ignored his advisors might be a gentle warning to the real king sitting right there. Riddles and wordplay were also a big part of the act. The jester was a master of language. He played with words, twisting their meanings to create clever and often insightful jokes. He would challenge the nobles with riddles that tested their wits. This was not just about being smart. It was a way of showing that things are not always what they seem. A good riddle forced you to look at a problem from a new angle. And this was excellent training for a court full of politicians and schemers. And yes, there was physical comedy. Juggling, acrobatics, tumbling, and slapstick were all part of the repertoire. This was the easiest and most universal form of humor. It required no language, just a skilled body. The jester might pretend to trip and fall, spilling a cup of wine on a pompous duke. This would break the tension in the room and remind everyone not to take themselves so seriously. A bit of physical comedy could humanize the powerful figures of the court. The jester did not just perform on the grand stage of the Great Hall. He was often a close companion to the Lord and his family. He might play with the children, teaching them songs and rhymes. He might have quiet conversations with the Lord or Lady, offering a different perspective on the day's events. He was a fixture of daily life, not just a performer who appeared at night. When the court traveled, the jester went with them. He was part of the mobile household, expected to entertain on the road, in drafty castles, or in military camps. The artificial fool, the professional, had to be incredibly skilled. He was an entertainer, but he was also an improviser. He had to react in the moment. If two nobles were having a tense argument, the jester might step in with a perfectly timed joke to defuse the situation. If the king received bad news, the jester had to know whether to offer a quiet distraction or to stay silent. This required immense social intelligence, so while we see the jester as a clown, he was more like a one-man variety show. He was a singer, a poet, a comedian, a storyteller, and an acrobat. His job was to manage the mood of the court. He kept boredom at bay. He eased tensions. He provided a shared experience that brought the court together. The performance was the most obvious part of his job, but it was just the tool he used to do his more important work. The laughter he created was the foundation for everything else he was meant to accomplish. Here we get to the heart of the matter. The jester's most important and most dangerous job was to speak truth to power. In the rigid hierarchy of a medieval court, this was almost impossible for anyone else to do. The king, the duke, the lord, he was surrounded by people who depended on him for their wealth and status. Knights, advisors, and courtiers were not going to risk their positions by telling the king he was wrong. They would tell him what he wanted to hear. They were sycophants. This created a dangerous bubble around a ruler. A king who only hears good news and praise is a king who is disconnected from reality. He can make terrible decisions based on bad information. He can become arrogant and tyrannical. He needs someone to give him a reality check, someone to tell him the truth, even when it is ugly. That someone was the fool. The jester operated under something called the fool's license. By wearing the motley and playing the part of the fool, he was given a special kind of immunity. He could say things that would get a knight or a bishop thrown in the dungeon or even executed. He could criticize a bad policy. He could mock a foolish decision. He could make fun of the king's new clothes. He did it all with a joke or a clever rhyme, but the message got through. Think about the psychology of it. If a serious advisor told the king, "My lord, your plan to raise taxes is angering the peasants and they might revolt," the king might see it as a challenge to his authority. He might get angry and punish the advisor, but if the jester sang a silly song about a king whose peasants were so poor they had to eat their shoes, the message was the same, but it was delivered in a non-threatening way. The king could laugh it off in public, but in private the seed of doubt was planted. He might start to think about his tax policy. The humor was a shield. It protected both the jester and the king's ego. There are many stories about jesters doing exactly this. One of the most famous court fools was Will Somers, who served King Henry VIII of England. Henry was a powerful and terrifying ruler. He executed wives, friends, and advisors who crossed him. Yet Will Somers could speak to him with incredible honesty. It was said that Somers was the only man who could make the king confront his own foolishness. After the execution of Anne Boleyn, when the court was terrified, Somers was able to gently joke with the king and help him through his dark moods. He was more than a comedian, he was a kind of therapist and a moral compass. Another famous jester was Triboulet, who served two French kings. He was known for his razor-sharp wit. One story says that a nobleman threatened to beat Triboulet to death for a joke he made. Triboulet went to his king, Francis I, and complained. The king told him not to worry. "If he dares to do it," the king said, "I will have him beheaded 15 minutes after." Triboulet replied, "Well, would it be possible to behead him 15 minutes before?" The joke highlights the precarious position of the jester. His only real protection was the king's favor. This role as truth-teller was a tightrope walk. The jester had to be clever enough to package his criticism in a way that was funny and not insulting. He had to know the king's moods perfectly. He had to know when to push and when to back off. A joke that was hilarious one day might be treasonous the next. The line between being a beloved advisor and a headless fool was very thin. So the jester was the king's conscience. He was the one person in the kingdom who could hold up a mirror to the ruler and show him his flaws. He did it with wit and performance, but the job was deadly serious. He was the official outsider on the inside, whose whole purpose was to keep the most powerful man in the country from getting lost in his own power. It was a role that required more courage and intelligence than any other in the court. And beyond entertainment and advising, the jester played a crucial role as a social manager. A royal court was a nest of ambition, jealousy, and strict rules. It was a place of constant, low-level stress. The jester's job was to act as a release valve for that pressure. He was a kind of social lubricant, making all the grinding gears of court life run a little more smoothly. Think of a formal state dinner. Powerful nobles from rival families are seated near each other. An ambassador from a foreign country is trying to navigate complex etiquette. The king is in a sour mood. The tension in the room could be cut with a knife. This is where the jester would shine. He could break the awkward silence with a song. He could perform a silly trick that made everyone, even the king, crack a smile. He could target a particularly arrogant nobleman with a light-hearted insult, and since it came from the fool, the nobleman had to laugh along with everyone else. It was a way to humble the proud without causing a real conflict. The jester was an expert at redirecting attention. If a heated argument broke out between two powerful lords, the jester might suddenly fall off his chair or start chasing a dog through the hall. The sudden chaos would break the momentum of the argument. Everyone would turn to look at the fool, and by the time they turned back, the heat of the moment had passed. He was a master of distraction, using his antics to prevent small conflicts from escalating into big ones. He also served as a strange kind of scapegoat. The jester often had a mock title, like the Lord of Misrule, especially during festivals. For a day, he would be in charge and everything would be turned upside down. Like this was a safe way for society to vent its frustrations. For a little while, the rules did not apply. This chaos was contained, and it made returning to the normal, rigid order a bit more bearable. In a more subtle way, the jester could take the blame for things. A king is not supposed to make mistakes. His authority depends on his image of being wise and powerful, but kings are human, and they do make mistakes. Now, if a king made a clumsy political move, the jester could make a joke about how he gave the king that brilliant advice. The court could then laugh at the fool's terrible idea instead of directly criticizing the king's bad decision. It was a clever way to preserve the king's dignity while still acknowledging the failure. The jester was also a unifying figure. In a court full of factions and rivalries, the jester belonged to no one but the king. He could move between different groups, talking and joking with everyone. He was a common point of reference. Everyone could laugh at the same joke, and for that moment, they were not rivals, but just people sharing an experience. This shared laughter helped to build a sense of community, however temporary, in a place that was designed to be competitive. Furthermore, he was a repository of court secrets. As the fool, he was often ignored. People would talk freely in front of him, assuming he was just a simpleton or that he was not paying attention. But a good jester was always paying attention. He knew who was having an affair with whom. He knew which lord was secretly in debt. He knew who was plotting against whom. He was an unofficial intelligence officer for the king. He could pass on this information, again, often through a seemingly innocent joke or a story. He could warn the king about a potential threat without ever making a formal accusation. So, the jester was the court's therapist, its mediator, and its safety valve. He managed the emotional temperature of a very stressful environment, where he used humor to smooth over social awkwardness, to de-escalate conflicts, and to allow people to express dissent in a safe way. It was a subtle and demanding job that required a deep understanding of human nature. The bells and the silly hat were a disguise for a very sophisticated social operator. So what happened to the court jester? Why don't modern leaders have an official fool to keep them humble and speak the truth? The role of the court jester faded away for several reasons. It was a job that belonged to a very specific time and a very specific kind of society. As that society changed, the jester became obsolete. The decline began around the 17th century. Courts themselves started to change. They became more formal, more centralized, and more civilized in a way that had less room for the chaotic energy of a fool. The kind of raw, personal power that a medieval king wielded was being replaced by more complex systems of government and bureaucracy. The intimate, household-style court of the Middle Ages was evolving into the more impersonal state. A major blow to the jester's profession was the invention of the printing press. Before print, information and satire were mostly spread by word of mouth. The jester was a key part of this. He was a performer and a living newspaper, but Once pamphlets, woodcuts, and satirical books could be printed and distributed widely, you no longer needed a single person in a silly hat to criticize the government. Satire became a thing the public could consume. You could buy a pamphlet that made fun of a politician, and you could read it in your own home. The jester's unique role as a truth-teller was democratized. At the same time, professional theater was on the rise. Instead of a single fool entertaining a court, you could go to a playhouse and see a whole company of actors. Shakespeare's plays are a perfect example of this transition. He wrote brilliant, complex roles for fools, but they were characters on a stage, not real figures in a court. The entertainment that the jester provided was now available to a much wider audience, and it was being done by specialized actors. The jester, who had to be a master of all trades, was replaced by specialists. The Age of Enlightenment also played a part. This period emphasized reason, logic, and decorum. The idea of having a fool, even an artificial one, seemed primitive and undignified to the new, rationalist sensibilities. A king was supposed to be a serious, enlightened monarch, not someone who needed a clown to tell him the truth. The jester started to look like a relic from a cruder, more superstitious past. By the end of the 18th century, the official court jester had all but vanished from Europe. The job was gone. But the function of the jester never disappeared. It just took on new forms. The spirit of the fool lives on today. Think about it. Who speaks truth to power now? Who uses humor to criticize the powerful and expose their absurdities? Our modern jesters are all around us. They are the political cartoonists in newspapers who can destroy a politician's image with a few strokes of a pen. They are the stand-up comedians like George Carlin or Dave Chappelle who get on stage and talk about the things that no one else is supposed to say out loud. They are the hosts of satirical news shows like Jon Stewart or John Oliver who use jokes and mockery to dissect political hypocrisy. These people are our court jesters. They don't wear motley or bells. Their stage is a television studio or a comedy club, not a king's hall. Their audience is the entire public, not a small group of nobles, but their job is fundamentally the same. They use humor to deliver uncomfortable truths. They hold up a mirror to our society and force us to look at ourselves. They have a kind of fool's license granted by the public. We allow them to say outrageous things because they are comedians, and it is their job to make us laugh. But through that laughter, they also make us think. The court jester may be gone, but the need for the jester is permanent. Every society and every person in a position of power needs someone to poke holes in their arrogance. Someone to remind them that they are human and fallible. The medieval jester's real job was to be that person. And it is a job that is still being done, just in a different costume.